He didn't even flinch when the professor spat the words at him, as if his very existence were a mistake scribbled onto the whiteboard. The entire lecture hall laughed nervously, complicit in silence, as if the humiliation of one man was too trivial to disturb their comfort. But that silence was the seed of an earthquake. Kwame sat in the third row, notebook open, pen trembling in his hand. He had always known that his skin was the first thing people saw, the loudest thing in the room before he ever spoke. Yet this time it was not just a look, not just a sneer in the corridor, it was a public execution of dignity. Professor Blake, with his sharp jawline and colder eyes, declared that students like Kwame had benefited enough from lowered standards. The words carried like a whip through the air, striking not just Kwame, but everyone who had ever felt small in that room. The professor's voice dripped with false casualness, as if commenting on the weather, but beneath it throbbed the steady beat of something darker. Entitlement so deep it had forgotten it was cruelty. For a second, Kwame's mind screamed to vanish, to fold himself into invisibility. Yet another voice, quieter but unshakable, rose within him. If you stay silent, they win twice. He locked eyes with the professor. A silence rippled, the kind that exposes every heartbeat, every nervous shuffle, the kind of silence that makes cowards uncomfortable. And then Kwame spoke not with fury, but with clarity that pierced through the smug armor in front of him. He asked a simple question: what does it cost you to believe I belong here? The room froze. It wasn't an answer the professor had rehearsed for. Outside the lecture hall, the city was burning in its own quiet ways. Posters peeling on street corners whispered of equality, but were trampled under hurried feet. Politicians made speeches about opportunity, yet entire neighborhoods still lived in the shadow of poverty lines drawn decades earlier. Kwame knew all this. What he didn't know was that by the end of the next day, his name would ricochet through Parliament, not as a victim, but as a catalyst. The night after the humiliation, Kwame couldn't sleep. His phone vibrated endlessly, friends, strangers, even journalists asking if the rumors were true. A video of the incident had leaked, filmed by a girl sitting 2 rows back. It had already reached 500,000 views. Every pause, every cruel smirk from Professor Blake, every flicker of pain across Kwame's face captured, replayed, dissected. People were not just watching, they were choosing sides. Kwame's mother called from back home, her voice carrying oceans of worry. "My son, do not let them break you," she said. She reminded him of his grandfather, who once stood unarmed before men with rifles, refusing to bow. "Dignity is heavier than fear," she told him, "but it will carry you further." By dawn, the story had outgrown the university. Lawmakers were tagged, activists mobilized, and talk show hosts sharpened their monologues. What had begun as an insult in a classroom was now a question echoing in the nation's conscience. How deep did the rot go, and who was willing to scrape it clean? Kwame walked onto campus that morning not as invisible as before. Strangers nodded in solidarity, while others avoided his gaze, afraid of the mirror his existence now held up to them. Professor Blake entered the lecture hall, pretending nothing had happened. But the air was no longer his to control. It was thick, charged, restless like the pause before a thunderstorm. When Kwame raised his hand that day, the entire hall turned toward him, not with ridicule, but with expectation. His voice didn't shake. He reminded the class, and by extension the world, that the pursuit of knowledge is corrupted when measured against the color of skin. "If education is only for the ones who look like you," he said, "then it's not education, it's inheritance." Within 24 hours, members of parliament were demanding answers from the university board. Debates erupted, not only about academic discrimination, but about the systemic cracks that had been ignored for too long. Some called Kwame a troublemaker, others called him a hero. But one truth was undeniable: silence had ended. And in that rupture, history began to shift. The video spread like wildfire, igniting living rooms, classrooms, offices, and even late-night diners where televisions flickered against cracked walls. People whispered about it in subway cars and argued about it on street corners. Every replay became heavier, the cruelty sharper, and Kwame's quiet defiance more profound. The country was addicted to the scandal, but what they were really consuming was their own reflection. By noon, journalists camped outside the university gates. Cameras glared like predators waiting for prey, their microphones poised to seize every syllable. The administration tried to maintain a brittle calm, issuing a vague statement about reviewing the incident, but it only poured oil on the fire. Students staged sit-ins, some holding signs that read education without equality is indoctrination. The campus, once indifferent, had transformed into a battlefield of ideals. Kwame, however, felt none of the grandeur others ascribed to him. Inside, he was torn between fear and responsibility. He hadn't asked to be a symbol, hadn't dreamed of leading a movement. He only wanted to learn, to carve out a place in a world that constantly reminded him he didn't belong. Yet now, with every eye watching, retreat felt impossible. To hide would be to betray the millions who saw themselves in his silence, in his refusal to bow. Professor Blake, meanwhile, hardened his stance. When reporters shoved microphones at him, he sneered. "This generation is too sensitive," he said. What happened was a simple academic remark taken out of context. His words rang hollow, brittle against the weight of the video evidence. The more he spoke, the more he revealed his disdain, and the more the public recoiled. The arrogance that once made him untouchable now exposed him as a relic of a world gasping to survive. That evening, a televised panel brought together professors, activists, and politicians. They debated fiercely, voices overlapping, some dismissing the uproar as youthful hysteria, others warning that this was only the tip of the iceberg. One panelist, a young congresswoman named Amara Diallo, cut through the noise with piercing clarity. "This is not about one classroom or one professor," she said. "This is about the invisible architecture of discrimination that holds power in this country. Kwame's humiliation is a symptom of a disease we've refused to diagnose." Her words, firm yet trembling with conviction, lit a fuse that would reach Parliament by morning. Kwame watched from his dorm room, his laptop glowing in the dim light. He felt a strange mixture of pride and dread as his name was spoken by leaders who had never cared for students like him before. His phone buzzed with messages from strangers, some offering solidarity, others spitting venom. One simply read, "Leave our country if you don't like it." He closed his eyes, whispering a prayer his grandmother used to say, "Let my steps be heavy enough to leave a mark, but light enough not to break the ground." The university board summoned him the next morning. Their meeting room reeked of polished wood and perfumed intimidation. Suits sat around the table, their smiles tight, their words rehearsed. They offered sympathy with one hand and silence with the other. "We must handle this delicately," the dean said, his voice dripping with the oil of diplomacy. "We cannot allow emotions to overshadow the integrity of the institution." Kwame realized then that they did not see him as a student, but as a storm to be contained. He left the meeting with his shoulders heavier, but his resolve sharper. Outside, students waited, their chants rising like thunder. "We stand with Kwame." For the first time, he saw his reflection not as one man, but as a multitude. He was not alone anymore. Meanwhile, Parliament prepared for a heated session. Lawmakers, pushed by public outrage, demanded accountability from the education minister. Questions flew. How many students had suffered in silence? How many doors had been quietly closed in the name of standards? The scandal forced the nation to confront its most uncomfortable truths, truths buried beneath decades of polite denial. The professor still believed he could weather the storm. He leaned on allies, men who whispered in private that the country was being hijacked by identity politics. But his arrogance blinded him to the fact that history was shifting beneath his feet. A new generation refused to inherit the silence of their parents. That night, Kwame was invited to speak on live television. The host asked if he considered himself a victim. He shook his head. "I am not a victim," he said softly. "I am a witness. And I refuse to look away. What happened to me happens every day to people who don't get recorded. If my humiliation can serve as proof, then I will not waste it." His words struck deeper than slogans, for they carried not anger alone, but the raw weight of lived truth. Back in Parliament, Amara Diallo quoted him in her speech. Her voice rose, echoing through marble halls, demanding reform, demanding that universities be audited, that policies be rewritten, that accountability no longer stop at apologies. "Education," she thundered, "is not a privilege for the privileged. It is the right of every citizen. And until this nation embodies that truth, We will tremble in the shadow of our hypocrisy. The chamber erupted in shouts, some clapping, others jeering, but the tremor had begun. Kwame, watching from afar, felt tears sting his eyes. He did not know what tomorrow would bring, whether justice or backlash, progress or punishment, but for the first time, he knew his voice mattered. And that was enough to stand. The pressure swelled like a storm trapped inside the nation's chest. Every headline screamed Kwame's name. Every radio broadcast dissected the same 30-second clip, and every political faction tried to seize the narrative. The scandal had mutated into something larger, a mirror exposing the hypocrisy of a society that had convinced itself it was post-racial. Kwame could feel the walls tightening around him. At night, he read threats in his inbox, anonymous voices promising violence, promising erasure. Yet alongside the hate came waves of support, handwritten letters from school children, phone calls from strangers who whispered blessings. He understood now that he was no longer just Kwame, the quiet student with ink-stained fingers. He had become a vessel, a lightning rod, and lightning always seeks a place to strike. Meanwhile, Professor Blake prepared his defense. He walked into studios with the confidence of a man who had always been granted the final word. He spoke of academic rigor, of standards being diluted, insisting that he was the true victim of a witch hunt. But each time his image flashed across the screen, more people recoiled. His words sounded less like reason and more like the last gasps of an era that refused to admit its cruelty. On campus, the protests grew louder. Students occupied hallways, sleeping on cold tiles beneath banners scrawled with urgent demands, justice for Kwame, and systemic bias. Professors divided themselves, some condemning Blake, others rallying behind him in whispers. The university administration tried to paint neutrality as wisdom, but neutrality in the face of injustice only deepened the wound. Kwame often sat at the edge of the crowd, silent, overwhelmed by the chaos swirling in his name. He felt guilty for the spotlight, guilty for the hope others pinned on him. One night, Amara Diallo called him directly. Her voice was calm but charged with energy, like a river held back by a dam. "Kwame," she said, "you don't have to be perfect. You just have to be honest. That's all people are asking of you." Her words steadied him. The next morning, Kwame stood on the steps of the library and faced the crowd. His heart pounded, his throat dry, but when he opened his mouth, his voice carried like a blade. "I did not choose this fight," he told them, "but I will not walk away from it. They can question my intelligence, my place in this university, even my worth as a citizen. But they cannot erase my humanity. And if they try, they will have to erase every one of you standing here, too." Cheers erupted, echoing against stone walls, spilling into the city streets. The speech was recorded, shared, and within hours it joined the viral clip as a rallying cry. Commentators began comparing Kwame's words to speeches that had once altered the nation's trajectory. Parliament, sensing the ground shaking beneath them, scheduled an emergency hearing on discrimination in higher education. Inside Parliament, tension pulsed like electricity. Lawmakers filled the chamber, journalists crowded the balconies, and outside the gates thousands of protesters gathered, their chants rising in waves. Amara Diallo prepared her notes, but she didn't need them. The weight of the moment sharpened her focus. She rose, adjusting her scarf, and began. "This nation has told itself a lie," she said. "That racism ended when the laws changed, that equality arrived simply because we declared it so. But laws mean nothing without practice, and equality is nothing without accountability. Look at the faces outside this building. They are not here for a single student. They are here because they recognize his humiliation as their own." The chamber buzzed with unease. Some lawmakers nodded, others scowled, but none could ignore her. As Amara spoke, Professor Blake sat in his office miles away, watching the broadcast with clenched fists. He told himself the storm would pass, that his colleagues would shield him. But deep inside, a crack widened. For the first time, he saw not respect in the eyes of his peers, but calculation. He was no longer an untouchable scholar, was a liability. Kwame watched the session with his fellow students, each word striking him with a mix of hope and disbelief. Never had he imagined his quiet challenge in a classroom could ripple this far. His phone buzzed again, this time with an invitation. The committee wanted him to testify. Fear shot through him like ice. He was not a politician, not a practiced orator. He was just a student. But silence had carried him this far, and silence would not carry him further. That night, he couldn't sleep. He remembered the professor's smirk, the laughter of his peers, the weight of humiliation pressing against his ribs. He remembered his mother's trembling voice over the phone, his grandfather's stories of resistance. He stared at the ceiling until dawn, whispering to himself the same question he had once asked his professor. What does it cost to believe I belong here? The following day, the hearing began. Cameras rolled, pens scratched across notepads, and the nation held its breath. Kwame entered the chamber, the youngest voice in a sea of seasoned officials. He felt small, unbearably small, but when he sat down before the microphone, something shifted. The silence around him was no longer oppressive, it was expectant. He spoke of the lecture hall, of the insult dressed as authority, of the centuries of echoes behind it. He spoke of the sleepless nights, of the threats, of the solidarity. His words were not polished, but they were raw, and raw truth cut deeper than any speechwriter's eloquence. Education should challenge me, he said, his voice steady now, but not for the color of my skin. Education should break my ignorance, not my dignity. If I must prove my worth every day just to sit in a classroom, then what kind of nation are we building? A nation of fear? Or a nation of hope? The chamber fell silent. Even those who opposed him could not deny the weight of his words. When he finished, Amara placed her hand over her heart, a gesture of quiet solidarity. For a fleeting moment, Kwame felt the burden lift not gone, but shared. Outside, the crowd roared as the news spread. The student had spoken, and the nation had listened. The weight of Kwame's testimony did not vanish with applause. It lingered, echoing through the marble corridors of Parliament, spreading into headlines, dissected in cafes, and debated on morning shows. His words refused to die. They breathed, they multiplied, they demanded answers. The government could not smother them with silence, and the university could not bury them in bureaucracy. Something irreversible had begun. For Professor Blake, the walls finally collapsed. His colleagues, once allies in quiet prejudice, now distanced themselves, retreating into shadows. He was suspended pending investigation, but suspension was merely a polite word for exile. Overnight, his reputation built over decades crumbled into dust. The man who once mocked Kwame with laughter now sat in his office surrounded by silence, staring at the hollow frame of his achievements. For the first time, he was the one shrinking under invisible judgment. Yet the story was never about one professor. It was about the system that birthed him, sheltered him, and rewarded him for cruelty. Parliament faced that truth when Amara Diallo demanded legislative reform, a nationwide audit of academic institutions, anti-discrimination oversight committees, scholarships, and protections for marginalized students. The debate grew heated, ugly at times, but the voices for change grew louder than the defenders of the old order. On the streets, momentum surged. Students marched not only for Kwame but for every silenced classmate, every rejected application, every dream clipped by prejudice. Parents joined them, alumni returned, professors who once stayed neutral now spoke out. The air felt thick with history, as if the ground itself trembled with anticipation of a turning point. Kwame stood among them, no longer just a face in the crowd but a pulse within it. He learned to accept the paradox. He was both one person and many, both fragile and unbreakable. In quiet moments, fear still gnawed at him, fear of retaliation, fear of failure. But when he looked into the eyes of strangers who clasped his hands and whispered thank you, he understood that courage was not the absence of fear, but the refusal to bow to it. The climax came when Parliament voted on Amara's reform bill. Cameras streamed live, millions glued to their screens. The chamber pulsed with tension, every gesture amplified. Detractors warned of chaos, of coddling, of division. Supporters countered with justice, with fairness, with a vision of a nation that no longer lied to itself. When the final vote was read, the result thundered through the air. The bill passed. Narrowly, but undeniably. Outside, the crowd erupted. Tears, cheers, embraced an orchestra of relief and determination. Change had not yet arrived, but the door had cracked open, and no hand could shut it again. Kwame stood still in the middle of it all, overwhelmed. He thought of the lecture hall where it began, the sting of laughter, the professor's smirk. He thought of his mother's voice, his grandfather's defiance, the generations that had carried wounds so deep they seemed eternal. And he thought of tomorrow not as a burden, but as a promise. That night, he returned to his dormitory. The chants still echoed faintly in the distance. He sat by the window, the city washed in golden light from street lamps and lingering sunset. For the first time in days, he allowed himself to breathe. He was not naive. He knew the struggle would continue. Hatred does not vanish with a single law, nor does equality bloom overnight. But he also knew this. Silence had been broken, and truth had found its voice. Across town, Amara dialed his number. "You did more than speak," she told him. "You reminded this country of its unfinished work. That is a gift no one can take back." Kwame closed his eyes, letting her words sink in. He realized then that history does not always belong to generals, kings, or presidents. Sometimes it begins with a single student in a classroom, refusing to lower his gaze. And as dawn approached, painting the sky in hues of gold, Kwame whispered to himself the words that had carried him from humiliation to hope. "What does it cost to believe I belong here?" The answer, he knew now, was everything. But the reward was a nation that could no longer pretend it did not hear him. The earth did not shake, the skies did not split. Yet in lecture halls, in parliament, and in the hearts of thousands who marched, something irreversible had changed. And that was enough to tremble even the walls of power. Thank you for listening. If you find it interesting, please like and subscribe to follow the next stories.